Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this New South Wales and Queensland webinar session. I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata and also the Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate, a Queensland body corporate management company. I'm your host for today's session, and today we're talking EV charging in your building. What is your building doing to get ready for EVs? Maybe you already have residents with electric vehicles charging in your building. Maybe people are starting to ask questions, or maybe it's not even on your committee's radar yet. With many varied viewpoints on electric vehicles, the right decision can be difficult to reach. Thankfully, we have Allan Parker from the Altogether Group here with us to navigate through this complex topic today. Don't despair, not only are there environmental and economic benefits, but property owners and developers can reap considerable gains in rent and property value if the correct choices are considered now. Now, today's session is applicable to New South Wales and Queensland, but we do ask if you do take anything away from the session today and you're outside of New South Wales and Queensland, please seek legal or other industry advice before relating this information to your specific state. So before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information in the session today, including the discussions arising from submitted questions and chat conversations, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice. So you should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in this session. We welcome Allan Parker, Executive Manager of the Altogether Group. Allan has a strong track record of delivering successful energy solutions from hardware to operations. He's well versed in the implementation of advanced energy solutions, from the installation of solar panels to the implementation of microgrids and energy storage solutions. His expertise and knowledge of the energy sector extends beyond the physical hardware to the backbone solutions and operations needed to ensure success. He's an expert in project management and energy infrastructure, having overseen the construction of several large-scale energy projects. Allan is passionate about finding new ways to improve energy efficiency and sustainability, and is constantly looking for innovative solutions to meet the demands of the changing energy market. His commitment to safety and efficiency is evident in all projects he's worked on, and he is highly regarded within the industry for his technical knowledge and dedication to quality service. So thanks so much for joining us today, Allan. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I suppose what I'd like to begin with is that the electricity or electrification of vehicles in Australia and the landscape. And I have had many comments in the past from the bodies that I talk to around the electric vehicle fad, if you like, and what does that really mean? And I suppose we at the Altogether Group have determined that indeed it has a landslide of weight behind this fad. That means I don't believe that it is going to be a fad and that it is something that we need to deal to. So that's what this presentation talks about. You know, the very first, I suppose, element of weight behind the electrification of vehicles in Australia is the National Electric Vehicle Strategy that the federal government has, which outlines the government's commitment to accelerate the adoption of EVs, right? So they're looking at addressing barriers to EV uptake, promoting charging infrastructure development, and supporting industry growth. So the government has a set target for new vehicle sales to be electric by 2030 and is working towards achieving that. So more and more of our strata members are going to be driving electric vehicles. And that poses a question to the strata community as to what we're going to do about that. Drivers for change. These drivers that I'm talking about include the cost of EV ownership and the coming down faster than has been previously projected. There's government incentives, Queensland EV strategy, for instance, and the New South Wales Future Transport Strategy, which are accelerating uptake of EV. Mainstream car production, plug-in hybrid and full electric models are being introduced by mainstream brands. In fact, I was out shopping for a plug-in hybrid yesterday with my wife. So it's interesting to see that most of the mainstream car production providers are introducing either a hybrid plug-in or full electric option within their range. Charging site expansion is occurring as we speak. So charging infrastructure is being released, and AGL released an announcement last week about a partnership that they had formed for the deployment of charging infrastructure. And corporate fleet electrification is also a key key attribute to accelerating change. And when we look at our members within the strata community, environmental concerns, there's a growing awareness around climate change and the need to reduce greenhouse emissions. So there's a weight behind this change. So the potential benefit for strata living. I suppose when somebody's looking at an electric vehicle, there's the economic benefits, which relate to fuel cost savings and maintenance cost savings, et cetera, et cetera. From a environmental perspective, we have benefits such as lower emissions. And from a long-term investment perspective, when you think about the application of charging, or what we call convenience charging in a strata environment, there's a potential to increase property values as the electric vehicle I suppose proliferation increases. More and more of the buyers of the properties within strata developments will be wanting to have access to that convenience charging from home. And I want to talk a little bit about what that convenience charging means. So with respect to your vehicle that you drive today, if it's not an electric vehicle, the level of convenience provided by the proliferation of fuel stations throughout Australia aids in the quick and easy refueling of your vehicle. You know, a 5-minute stop to pick up fuel, you can pick up water, you can pick up your groceries, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, it's a very, very convenient means of refueling your car. From a convenience perspective, electric vehicle readiness in strata is not plug and play. So giving access to your community with respect to convenience charging is not as easy as just allowing the vehicles to come in and plug into the infrastructure. So we have a significant challenge there, and I've tried to break down what those I suppose those challenges are from a complexity perspective for our strata environment. So there's a challenge first in terms of the individual unit owners, the property managers and the strata committees in meeting the expectations of their community. So understanding what the expectations are of the communities with respect to availability of convenience charging within their communities. The next challenge or complexity is infrastructure planning. And these things relate to the available car spaces, the electrical capacity, and giving equal access to all within the actual strata community. The electrical upgrades, et cetera, have an impact on the complexity for strata, because you have in many cases, a limited supply to the strata community. And that limited supply needs to be managed carefully for two reasons. In bulk metered circumstances, where it's a community that is an embedded network, introducing additional capacity related to convenience charging will increase the demand on the site and drive costs up. And almost to the point in some buildings where it will cause power blackouts. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. In implementing this infrastructure, if there's electrical upgrades and capacity restraints and investment required, we need to work out how that cost is allocated and how is it borne by those members of the community. Those that have the uptake will be very keen to take on that cost. Those that don't will feel threatened and not want to be paying for the convenience that they don't enjoy. Parking management. The assigning and dedication of parking spots is already a complex issue within strata. It's made even more complex by introducing convenience charging. Then you need to look at the strata bylaws and the regulations. So navigate your way through the legal and bureaucratic processes to obtain approvals to be able to proceed. And the kind of things that you need to consider, they don't appear on the face to be large issues, but once you delve into the detail, they can become quite complicated. So I'll give you an example. For instance, if you were providing a car parking space for shared charging, for convenience charging, where the community would want to install a single charger and have the community share that charger for convenience charging, where do you put that? What visitor parking is taken up? How does that affect the use of visitor parking by an owner? They're the kind of bylaws that sort of start to rear their ugly head as you start to progress through. And then there's the future proofing and scalability. I spoke about in the earlier slide, there being a wave of government reform behind the uptake of EVs. That is set to continue, and it will build and build and build as we progress. What is EV charging? What is convenience charging? I think I would like to start with, I suppose there's four main options for convenience charging in EV space. There's the trickle charger. It's a simple plugs into an existing power point. Typically it comes with the car and the bag with the car. Maximum it can be in Australia is 2.4 kilowatts. Most of them are around 1.8 kilowatts. Takes 15 to 20 hours to charge your vehicle. I hardly consider that a convenience charging option, in particular if you use the vehicle every day. I've got a comment down here, which is no central control. And that's an important comment, and I'll delve into that later, because we need to examine what the impact of this additional load is on the building. I'll skip the accelerated charging, which I think is where the future is in terms of convenience charging within strata, or indeed across Australia. You've then got your DC fast charging. That's between 23 kilowatts and 50 kilowatts. It uses the charger itself to control the amount of energy going into the vehicle. Typically, it charges from flat in 1 to 1.5 hours. And the nature of it in applying this to the strata network is that it requires a shared space to be installed. So it opens up those issues that you have around fairly managing the use of that. One of the issues that creates for us is that load cannot really be managed. It will be a function of who's parked in that spot and who's using that charger at that time. Because from a convenience perspective, they need to get their charge in their 1.5 hour time spot so that they can move on and let the next person in. Then there's this DC super fast charging. One of the restrictions to this DC super fast charging is that not all vehicles could take super fast charging, to be quite frank at the moment, but I expect that the vehicles will move along in terms of technology over time. But it's still, from a community perspective, it is expensive to install. It also has no possible, what I call dynamic load management, because when you plug your car in, if you're expecting a charge in 10 minutes, you wouldn't want that charger to turn off in that 10-minute period because of some demand issue. You'd expect to come back and your car to be charged. So it doesn't seem to me to be a sensible solution for convenience charging within strata. So that leaves us with accelerated charging. And what is accelerated charging? That's between 7 kilowatts and 22 kilowatts. Professional installs required. DLM, which is dynamic load management, is possible without significant performance impact. And typically it takes 3 to 4 hours, in some vehicles' cases, probably 6 hours to charge using the accelerated charger. So from a convenience perspective, it is the most convenient option for charging. So enabling accelerated charging. Upgrading the main switchboard may be required. or necessary for the EV infrastructure. I spoke a little bit earlier about dynamic load management system. This adjusts the power supply and balance it between the chargers to allow the optimum charging time. Part of the things that you need to think about is your cable pathways. So how you get a protected pathway for your cables to run to the various parking spots where you select for your convenience charging. And you need to deal with the metering. How is the energy going to be metered that's used? Ensuring that fair billing practices are maintained, and you gain access to the data and monitor the electricity demand to ensure that we don't have capacity overloading. So approvals and process, the roadmap. And I think this is, and I want to start with an observation I've made around the EV changes that are coming. There's a lot of discussion and concern in and around fire safety. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with respect to implementing a charging provision that comes with introducing an EV vehicle. It's interesting to note that the risk of fire related to a EV vehicle is not just related to when it is refueling. The risk of a fire and a risk to your community with respect to an EV vehicle occurs as soon as an EV vehicle enters the car park. So with regards to EVs, whether or not you are introducing a charger, you need to think about access and the fire-related issues to parking electric vehicles within your strata community. Because it's the aggregation and the concentration of the lithium-ion type batteries that changes the dynamic in terms of the fire dynamic within that facility. Introducing a convenience charger is just introducing an additional set of circumstances where a fire may take place. It's not introducing the risk of fire. The actual fact of driving the vehicle within the parking area introduces that. So it's important that I think that strata communities think about the impact of the increase of the number of vehicles in their parking environment, irrelevant of whether they deal to this issue of convenience charging. So working out your roadmap for implementation. I suppose the very first step is you need to think about, as a community, what you need. What are you going to need? What does your strata community want? Right? Do they want to have shared charging? Do they want to have individual unit lot owner charging? Do they want to provide for everybody having individual unit charging? And the first step for that is probably the energy assessment. Right? Because I think once you've determined where your likely endpoint is going to be, you need to work out what the barriers are. So the next step is your energy assessment. And that's examining crucial factors, which I'll delve into in a minute, such as historical peak energy loads and supply availability and what are your current usage patterns, et cetera, et cetera. The committee then and the community needs to evaluate their options, think about what they look like, think about how they may want to pay for those options. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. Then they need to consider the bylaws and the structure that they need to put in place to facilitate that option. And then we delve into the planning application process. And I've got a slide in just a minute that just talks a little bit about that. Seeking approval. Now, I don't want everybody to take this as an absolute guide to the approvals that have been that are deemed to be necessary, but I've tried to draw out the core approvals that are necessary with respect to New South Wales and Queensland. I've also got a little bit around Victoria, but I won't spend much time on that slide. So at a body corporate level, you've got to get body corporate approval, whether that is via a special or an ordinary resolution, depends on the nature and the type of the decision that you're making. And I'd encourage you to seek some advice in relation to that with regards to your specific bylaws. From a legislative perspective, in Queensland, the Body Corporate and Community Management Act and the Body Corporate and Community Management Regulation is what you would consult. In Queensland, from an approvals perspective, if you're thinking about a officer facilitating EV charging, there are requirements that vary between council jurisdictions around the application for and being granted planning approval to install that infrastructure. One of the consistent elements is the consideration of the impact to fire protection, which is what I was talking about earlier with respect to parking vehicles that contain lithium-ion batteries and a whole lot of more stored energy in a different chemical form than what fuel is. Within Queensland, fire services, so the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services body has produced a position statement which sets out considerations for a private certifier to consider or a council certifier to consider with respect to the fire provisions for electric vehicles. Where this relates to fire suppression in the building, it looks at detection, having adequate detection, having adequate suppression systems for the energy type that's within the actual premise. But then when it applies to the refueling or the ability to charge those vehicles, it looks at having centralized emergency isolation. It looks at requirements for having a detailed map of where the charging locations exist to protect the fire personnel that may be called upon to go within that building. By its nature, it's a guideline and a position statement. So I think the challenge is that every building in terms of its application will be different in Queensland, sorry. From a New South Wales perspective, they have been a bit more proactive, I suppose, application from a government, a legislative perspective, introducing the Sustainable Infrastructure Resolution that only requires a 50% majority. The Strata Schemes Management Amendment on Sustainable Infrastructure Bill 2020 is basically that enabler. Also, specifically, refueling or electrical infrastructure related to enabling EV refueling is exempt from the environmental planning policy. And Fire Services New South Wales are currently conducting a similar review to what Queensland have done with respect to their expectations around the minimum levels of fire protection. So it's I suppose, an evolving environment is the key issue. So I spoke a little earlier about the energy assessment and system constraints. And what I've tried to do here is probably give a bit of an understanding, try and make it simple for those that aren't looking at energy every day of the week like I am. So forgive me for those of you of a technical nature, if I oversimplify, but I want to try and simplify it. So if you look at this illustrative view here, your current load is the circle in the middle, and that's what your building uses from a day-to-day perspective, and that varies. But if you think about your current load and this circle being the maximum, you then go to introduce additional charging for EV. That's additional, and it must fit within the maximum capacity of the site. And the maximum capacity of the site from two perspectives. The first is the physical or the safe operation capacity of the site. And the second is from the capacity with which that you pay for if you have an embedded network. So that goes directly to the cost. And I've prepared a bit of a slide here, which is going to look a little bit confusing for those of you that aren't used to looking at load graphs. All right. This is a demand graph for a typical building, right? This building is an apartment building, which is what we call bulk metered. It has about 200 units within this building. And this is a 12-month period, which sort of shows the peak of consumption throughout the year. So you can see that you have a higher peak during that summer season. In the middle of the year, you get a little mini peak, and then it builds back up to summer at the end of the season. These straight lines here reflect the maximum capacity charge for the building. So each month you get charged for the 30-day period for the maximum capacity value. Now, it works differently in different jurisdictions in terms of how that's applied and whether that's carried forward for 12 months or whether that's just a single charge. But in essence, it's an element of the bill when you have an embedded network. This graph to the right-hand side shows us a typical day. Actually, I've shown 2 days so that you can see either end of the day. So basically, this is the peak period between 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock, going down over the evening and then rising up in the following day. So, and this is the worst day. So a case study, looking at the introduction of some vehicle refuelers into this building, we have the same profile that I spoke about before. And this red line here is the impact of introducing just 10 vehicles to this building. So you can see that it makes a significant impact. Now, what I've done for the purposes of illustration is I've indicated these vehicles parking and starting to use their charger from about 4 o'clock in the afternoon progressively until about 8 o'clock at night. So you can see that progressively pushes the demand up. And I think the point that I want to make about the scale of this demand is that the demand scale relative to the building's consumption is quite high. You know, you've only got 15 vehicles here, or 10 to 15 vehicles parking here. And I've got a selection of those vehicles just to add a little bit of color. And this dotted line at the very top of this is the absolute site capacity. So what that means is it doesn't, on your worst day, it doesn't take much to drive your capacity up above where it becomes a physical limit. And that would result in additional costs at a very minimum and damage to the system. So from my perspective, well, for any building's perspective, that's not a sustainable outcome. What this particular graph shows is the introduction of demand management, right? So what does demand management do? This is dynamic load management. It slows down the charger. So these convenience-based chargers or accelerated chargers, centrally controlled, slowed down to defer the charging over a longer period of time. And you can see from the graphical representation that the demand, people still plugging in at the same time, but the charger manages those plugged in vehicles over time to below that period. And the charge time is not extended by very much, probably about an hour or so. And that time is about 3 a.m. So the vehicles are then charged in much the same way. They get the same level of charge, yet we've utilized some capacity at a later period. So dynamic load management is an absolute necessity for managing demand impact on your building. So I might dive away from the demand management. So there's a number of ways that you can choose to fund a infrastructure to provide this capability for convenience charging. The Owners Corporation's Capital Fund or Sinking Fund, where the Owners Corporation pays up front. You can raise special levies from owners, whereby you ask the owners to contribute to building that fund. You could also seek some level of providing that your strata rules allow. You could also seek to make a loan or to fund it externally. The other option, though, is a third-party infrastructure funding, whereby the Owners Corporation pays a funding fee and there's some variable ways of doing this to pay for that infrastructure over time. And then there's also the option of co-funding it, sharing that cost across the two options of third party and co-funding. Now, I was asked a couple of questions about recovery of money related to infrastructure upgrades, and it's a bit of a I suppose a tightrope you walk as a strata committee and as a strata group. So if you operate an embedded network, one of the key things that you need to be aware of is as the embedded network operator, being the actual body corporate, you are not allowed to operate as a business, right? So, and the attributes of operating as a business include taking volume risk, making profit, and speculation on those types of things. So you are restricted in how you recoup money from the strata members with respect to infrastructure upgrades. And in particular, one of the key things you've got to be careful of is you're not looking to recover that from your members via a volume-based charge, because that is could be considered as taking risk and operating a business. So that's one of the aspects. I'm not saying it's prohibited outright, but you have to be careful about exposing your strata management and your committee to any form of liability related to that. So you need to be very, very careful in and around how you recover money for these funding options. And it's a bit of a labyrinth that you need to seek some advice on, is what I would like to say. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a very whirlwind presentation on some of the things to consider. And I'd like to open up now to some questions, if that's all right.
Thanks so much, Allan, for the presentation. And as you mentioned, it's such a complicated topic and you've been able to simplify a lot of the major points down for us. So thank you for that. I thought some of the slides were fantastic. The complexities for strata and the roadmap that you presented, I think they were really great to follow, and they should give a lot of value to our viewers. We might go to some of the questions that were already submitted to us. Petrol pumps aren't installed in our car park, in our building. Therefore, why are we obliged to install EV chargers?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And I suppose the key issue relates to convenience. Okay, so at the moment, to refuel an electric vehicle, the infrastructure does not exist at the level that petrol pumps exist throughout the community. And indeed, even the very best charging option, which is the fast DC charger, will see you wait 15 to 20 minutes for your vehicle to be charged. All right. So those people that are looking to be owners of electric vehicles will be seeking to have convenience charging options available to them. So from that perspective, it is different to the petrol application, if you like. And it's sort of the strata becomes, they've got a question to answer. Do they want to provide that convenience charging provision? And if they do, how do they want to bear that cost and how do they want to share that cost?
Okay, and one of the other things was to do with, if you're installing these chargers and you're making the building EV friendly, the impact that could have on the building itself, and also if you've got owners that are looking to sell their building and the demand for that service looking forward.
Yes, 100%. So from my perspective, I've spoken to a number of real estate providers in the Queensland area, and certainly it's increasingly becoming a question that's asked of lot buyers. So people looking for units, and in particular, they want the option to be able to have convenience charging, and how that gets layered in terms of property value is yet to be seen, but certainly demand drives price. So there's strong indicators of demand
Thank you. All right, we had another one. Is there any discussion about mandating the provision of EV charging stations in existing strata buildings? And if so, what are these likely to be? And what is the possible timeline for complying with such regulations?
Yeah, so New South Wales, there is actually a position paper on that you can refer to with respect to new developments. It's a challenge for any government introducing it retrospectively because of all of the complexities that I've pointed out. So I fully expect the Queensland government to tackle that as part of their, I suppose, their pathway to EV and a pathway to electrification of the travel within Australia. So I can't point to any specific timeline, but I certainly think it's an emerging area.
Okay, and then in regards, you mentioned New South Wales Fire Services is doing a report and it's not quite ready yet. Do you have any idea of when that will be out?
They have a position paper. And that position paper is able to be viewed, and it relates specifically to the installation of refueling within unit complexes, right? And that position paper talks about the kind of considerations that they expect from a private certifier or a certifying organisation to address. And again, I touched on the elements of that, and that related. Currently, it relates to having centralised emergency control, having a map where to make isolation, where the charges exist, and having adequate fire detection and suppression systems. And I think that's unique to every building.
Okay, thank you. Whilst the Queensland Fire Emergency Service position statement isn't saying don't allow EV charging, they do raise significant concerns, and most retrofits require significant investment. If a body corporate provided basement car park EV charging facilities, how would building insurance be affected in the event of an EV fire? And an outdoor EV charging station, is that a better choice?
The concern in and around insurance premiums is a real one. All right. Australia's been hit by climate change impacts, including flood events, et cetera, and every person's insurance premium has taken a hit as a result of that. Introducing an additional level of risk will no doubt have an impact on an insurer's approach to pricing. I think that's inevitable. Can I comment on what that looks like? No. And I think that's the trade-off, and that's the significant complexity that we speak about, that the bodies corporate need to think about.
We had a session with Tyrone Shandyman about insurance price increases, one of our webinars, and the question was asked in that session about whether EV charging will increase the price of insurance. And according to Tyrone, at this point in time, the insurance industry hasn't recognised it as a risk, and so it won't have any impact. But Tyrone had mentioned that as soon as they start having claims coming through, that's probably something that they will look at.
Agreed. I agree.
Our committee chairperson said we need a structural engineer to inspect and recertify our driveway ramp to the basement car park, as it can only hold up to 2.5 tonnes and EVs are 30% heavier than petrol cars. Is this a building defect? Our building was only finished in 2017 and is in good condition. How are other schemes approaching their ramp weight limits? And is there any official standard or test that needs to be met? We received another similar question in relation to whether buildings built prior to 2019 have the structural integrity to withstand the retrofitting of EV chargers, but probably more importantly, the actual cars themselves.
Yeah.
And the other question we received through had a lot to do with fire safety as well. So just touching on those points, Allan.
I sort of reiterate, the reality is that Strata needs to deal with the increased number of EV vehicles within the community. And whether or not you provide convenience charging is one element of what you need to do to plan for that. It's not the be all and end all, right? So even letting the vehicles park within, and that particular question highlights the issue. I'm not sure of what the structural requirements or certification requirements would be on vehicle ramps, because that's not my area of expertise. But it just highlights the challenge, I think, that every community now faces. It's a complex environment. Enabling your building for electric vehicles is not just enabling them to charge, I suppose, is the message.
And it seems to me the message is also, if you're thinking about doing it, then really get some advice, because there seems to be lots of overlapping legislation that you need to be complying with, and also we're opening up all these other areas as well. So definitely speak to somebody like yourselves to start that conversation and then get direction from there.
Correct. That's 100% right.
Okay, so what do you do, given the immense cost to all owners, if the body corporate committee is just refusing to have the discussion and they're just saying no to installing EV charging stations?
Good question. That's a very good question. I suppose you need to get change within the body corporate governance, right? So you need to get the right people on those committees, and I think that have a view to future, and the right answer is not to be an ostrich and put your head in the sand and say that this is not going to happen. I reiterate, there's a bit of a tidal wave behind this electric vehicle movement, and this whether or not you provide convenience charging is just a outcome of that. So I think committees need to get it firmly in their view, work out what their plan or what their risks are, and come up with a plan to manage that.
And it does come down to majority, doesn't it? So if you can lobby with other lot owners in the building and have a talk to them. I'm not sure of the situation in New South Wales, but I know definitely in Queensland you can submit a motion as an owner. So you can submit a motion to the AGM, and if you've got some support behind you, then put that to your committee. I think even if the committee's not making the decision, they need to be thinking about what's happening with their maintenance plan, if you would agree, so that they're making something allocation for it in the future. And we've got a session with QIA coming up in a couple of weeks' time, and it's talking about how you can look after your commitments that you need to make to keep the building repaired, but then looking forward to any future retrofits or improvements that you can make to the building. Can we convert visitor parking spots to EV charging stations? And if we do, is council approval required to change the use of the car space?
Yeah. Yes, and yes. That's 100%, and also your bylaws need to be addressed. Typically, a bylaw in Queensland will refer to that visitor parking is expressly prohibited for owners. So if you're using a visitor's car park to charge a vehicle, you need to address your bylaws.
How does council react to that? I mean, they allocate how many parking spots or visitor parking spots are in a building, don't they? So then how do they, if you've only got two visitor parking spots and you're wanting to convert them, say, both over to EV chargers, what's their reaction usually, Alan? Do you know? Or
I think the issue is that you won't be able to remove the visitor car parking, all right? So I think you'll need to make them dual use. And if you make them dual use, one of the issues that creates for you is visitors with non-electric vehicles are completely entitled to use that. And if that's the case, it's going to reduce the convenience charging aspect of the shared charger. I kind of think shared charging, and this is my own personal opinion, is a trap for the body corporate. I kind of think that shared charging will just bring a labyrinth of complaints and other issues that come with trying to manage fairness, if you like, within a body corporate.
Like you mentioned, parking is already an issue, let alone with putting this other area of complexity on top of it as well. And a lot of that would fall back on the committee to manage. That's something else that they're looking to have to keep control of as well. Okay. Yep. And can I just ask you, when you were mentioning about the demand management, I found that really interesting, and the case study I think was great that you presented. So if you've got a building and say 3 owners have gone out and purchased electric vehicles and they've been given approval to have their own personal charging stations in their bays, would they have some sort of demand management control on them? No. Okay, so it's only
and that's the issue. It's snuck up on everybody, right? And the key issue with these AC, and we call them AC accelerated chargers, right? And they're the things that are being sold, the Tesla manufacturer, ABB manufacturer, Schneider manufacturer, et cetera. Most of them are enabled with demand management. Most of them you can program to have a maximum charge rate, et cetera. But you can't consider the body corporate to be technically savvy enough to recognize the issue and impose such conditions on that installation. So they come in, they're installed, and they're not controlled. And that's may not seem like a big issue. You've got 1 or 2 or 3, but to put it into context, a 7.2 kilowatt charger, which is what the average accelerated charger is for single phase. That's 7.2 kilowatts at peak charge. That's the equivalent of 2.5 units demand. So for every car, it's 2.5 units. So from that perspective, when I showed you that graph, you saw that the demand varied, and it varied by climatic conditions, for instance, right? Now, how often you have your air conditioner on, and it's a pool of people, but there's no diversity factor in a charger, right? It's on, it's charging, it's going its hardest. It doesn't care if it's hot, cold, Wednesday, Sunday, it doesn't care, right? So unless you have centralized control, you will be subject to demand. Now, I did notice just on the screen, a related question, which relates to the 240 volt options. They pose an issue as well. It's just the scale, right? So you've gone from 7.2 kilowatts to 2.4, but having people plug in their 2.4 kilowatt charger and running at the same time, it'll just mean that there'll be more cars plugged in before you get a problem, but the problem will still exist. I think for strata, if you're going to think about charging, you need to have the ability to control and manage that charging system so that there's no harm and no cost impost which is placed on the building as a result of the aggregate charge.
And now's really the time to do that, isn't it? I'd imagine, because you've got buildings out there that might just have a couple of lot owners that have got EV vehicles, but it's just, as you say, it's a bit of a tidal wave that's coming, and so you need to be putting the thought into it now. It takes time to get new bylaws developed by the lawyers and then to put in place and to register them, so it's still something else that needs to be done.
We just completed a project. 70 lot owners live in this particular building. We've installed the provisions for 24 chargers, right? We opened it up to people to connect, and that was about a month ago. We've received 10 applications, so it's nearly 50% taken up, right? So that's how quickly that's happened in that. Now I suppose the dynamic of those lot owners is unique with respect to the location, et cetera, but the demand's there, right? And in this particular case, we have got dynamic load control, and we have got a plan to manage that. And the developer went through the process of understanding what they needed to do with their bylaws and plan with respect to the fire protection systems and the isolation systems, et cetera, et cetera. So it's achievable. It's achievable to get through that labyrinth.
And you need to get a feel for how many of your lot owners, I guess, are just thinking about it, but they haven't considered actually purchasing an EV vehicle because they don't have capacity to charge it at home in their car parking. And then once the building introduces that, you might find that, as you found in that building, that a lot of people were actually obviously thinking about it, and then they've made the jump because the capacity's there now. So you need to, I guess, build that into anything that you're doing within the building as well. Make sure you've got a bit of contingency there.
Yep. Agreed.
Thank you so much, Allan. It was a great conversation. I found it really, really interesting. I hope everybody else did as well. And I hope that it was helpful in navigating this new space that we're in that's changing quite rapidly, keeping us on our toes as with everything with Strata.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.